For more on this, we're joined now live by Chris Gambian, who's the Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. Morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Chris, can we just take a step back for a minute? Can you explain what's happened to the koala population in New South Wales recently?
Yeah, well, the simple thing is that they are on the brink of extinction. We had a parliamentary inquiry last year that said by 2050, it is likely that we won't have koalas in the wild in New South Wales. I think after the bushfires, the chances of that year being brought dramatically forward is quite high. So it's a pretty perilous state that koalas are in New South Wales.
And the reason why we're talking to you today is about this new state environmental planning policy. There already was one in existence, so it's basically been amended. That's what's happened here. In your view, did the original plan, was that enough to fix the problem?
Well, look, it was a thing to fix the problem. The government had gone through quite a good process. Last year and the year before, there'd been extensive consultations. There had been good scientific advice that created this new planning policy that said, these are the species of trees that we need to protect. If you've got potential core koala habitat on your property, before you do a development, you're going to need to just do a survey, make sure that you're not going to be inadvertently damaging koala populations or koala feed trees and things like that. Then you might remember, having gone through that very good process, the Deputy Premier, Mr Barilaro, sort of blew the whole thing up and threatened to bring down the government. And so what we've got today is a very, very poor, pale imitation of that process and that policy.
So what's your problem? What's your problem with the compromise that's been made between the Liberals and the Nationals?
Well, the big problem is that it excludes agricultural land. So what's called an R zone, that's rural zone. It excludes that property. So, koalas don't tend to live in apartment blocks. They live in trees and they live in farmland. All of that land across New South Wales has been excluded, with the exception of some small parts in Sydney.
Well, not small parts in Sydney. Doesn't it? It does include the Central Coast and the Blue Mountains, doesn't it?
Oh, sure. But when we're talking about what needs to be done to protect koalas across New South Wales, it excludes enormous parts of very important koala habitat up the coast, out west. Really, the koala populations in Sydney are important but negligible. Blue Mountains, Central Coast, these are all pretty small areas compared to the other zones.
They're not areas where we typically see koala populations or a high density of koalas.
Well, look, there are definitely koalas around the Sydney metropolitan area, of course, and they've got their own threats at the moment from housing developments. But when you go sort of north of the Central Coast, and certainly as you get right up into the North Coast, that's where large parts of koala populations are, into the west. So these are all areas that would... And this was, of course, the flashpoint last year when all of this came up.
Yeah.
These were the areas that were most sort of in the conversation.
So because Rob Stokes, the planning minister, says the compromise actually only applies to a small percentage of land. 95% of land where development occurs in New South Wales would be covered under the policy. But as your point... it's that remaining 5% that's the issue.
Well, no. What Rob Stokes is being a bit misleading when he says that, because what he's not including is the large tracts of forest, which is where koalas live, that are excluded entirely. Well and good to say that there's a compromise around a small part of development land, but this is missing the point of the problem itself. We've got two problems. One is that the regulation around private native forestry are being completely decoupled from the planning system. So we don't, they tell us, trust us, there'll be a native forestry code that comes into place to regulate all of that, and, it'll be robust and all of that. So that's one part that's completely missing. The other part that really gets lost in all of this is the minister alone will have the power to determine whether or not a rural zone can be converted into what's called an E zone, which is a more environmentally protected zone, which takes the power away from councils. And most importantly, it means that if you've got a property that a property developer wants to subdivide that's currently in R zone, which is what's happening on the North Coast, then you really, you've got pretty free rein.
Okay. Look, Chris Gambian, fascinating issue, and obviously one we'll follow closely. But look, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
It's Chris Gambian, the Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales.